Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Hopefully, tomorrow will be our last session. So, in yesterday's session, we have discussed about the SFTP connectivity and where we see that how we can perform FTP operation and we can place the file over server, create integration in a such a way that we can use the file while placing the file over server, all these things. Now, in this video, we are going to learn about how we can invoke REST API or any third-party system from Oracle integration to perform transaction. For example, we are going to create AP invoices from front end, right? So how we can create AP invoices using Oracle integration with the help of REST API. So all these things we are going to learn in this video. So let's begin. So here you can see this is the invoice homepage, like where we are going to create invoices. For creating the invoice, we have to navigate to the task and click on the create invoice. And if you will see, we are going to right now we are going to create invoices from front end, right? So for creating the invoice, there are few mandatory details that we should pass, and the rest of the details are coming from the configuration, right? Whatever configuration we have done for the payable invoices. So suppose I'm just going to create invoices for BS1 unit, US1 business unit. I'm going to select supplier as lead supplier. And here let me give the name as XX invoice ID and V001. So this is the invoice number I'm going to give you. And here we have the basic details like invoice description. And here we have to provide the line details. And let me first provide the invoice amount, 1000, line details, 5000, distribute set is select as miscellaneous or anything based on the your requirement, whatever you have, we can select here. So suppose we have two lines and both line having the different amount. And the line don't required, so click from here. Now we created invoice. In the invoice, we have two lines and we provided the details. So here you can see once we will click on save and close, the invoice will be created in the system. So you can see invoice created, and once we will move and search invoices, you can see we are able to see the invoices, and once invoice created, a status is in not validated. So we have to do validation. After that, we have to go for payment and all. So here we can see how we can create invoice from front end. Now same invoice we have to create from back end. For creating the invoice from backend, we have the API, we have the invoice API. You can see I have already make a note of that API here. So this is our Oracle Fusion instance host, and this is the URL for creating the invoices. And the method is selected as post. So if you will see, we can search the same API. Here you can see we have various API for different transaction in Fusion. As we have to go for REST API, so you can see right now we are at the REST API for Oracle Fusion Financial Cloud. And here if you will see, as we have to create the invoices, so here you can see we will have the invoice, and once you will expand the invoice, you can see we have the API to cancel the invoice, we have API to create an invoice, all the details, right? So here let me select to create an invoice. And here you can see this is the API with method at post, and the same I used in the postman. You can see here FSC and REST API resources, invoices, resources, and invoices. And for this API, we required some payload. So from where we get the payload? So if we will move here, you can see this is the request payload to create AP invoices. Even that invoice we have at any attachment, we can pass the attachment. If we have the DFF, we can pass the DFF here, and the invoice installment and the invoice line details, the distribution, all these things we have here only. So with the help of this API only, I created one simple payload, and here you can see in the rest only we provided the payload to create the invoices. So you can see on the screen, the first we have the value as invoice header details. invoice number, invoice currency, amount, invoice date, business unit, supplier, supplier site, all these details. Like invoice group, we have right now it's empty, description, and inside the line details, we have, as we have 3 lines, so that's why we have the 3 line details here. You are able to see, right? So we are going to create invoices with this 3 line. So let me update the value. So I am going to give the name as XXINV test, rest test, and I'm going to give the value as 382023_01. The same I am going to give the invoice date as 23, and again here I will give 23, 23, and the accounting date 23. So now our payload is ready, and once we will click on send, the data will be passed to this API, and that API will return back the data as invoice created. So let me clear this previous response, and once we will click on send, you can see the same data passed to the Fusion with the help of this API, and Fusion created an invoice and it returned back the invoice ID. Here you can see while creating we don't have invoice ID, but once invoice created, it returned back the invoice ID. And the same invoice we can search from front end. So let me copy the invoice number from here, and here you can see this is our Fusion, and here we can search the invoice. So we given the invoice number. Once we click on search, you can see the invoice created in the system with a status not validated. That can be due to configuration setup. So here in invoice we have the configuration setup for tax. That's why it's in validated status, and we have to go for validate. Here you can see right now in line we have the line details, and right now we don't have tax details. So here for validating, if I will go for validate, it will not validate yet because we have to go for the tax. So here you can see once we click on the validate, you can see it's mentioned as need revalidation, and why revalidation? It's calculated a tax based on the setup we have. So tax amount you can see 570. So here we have to 570, we have to add in the invoice header amount. So if I will go and edit the invoice, and here we have to add this amount 570, and then once I will go for validate, then it will be validated. Total amount here you can see it's 6570. Same we provided here. So let me save and close. So here, friend, there can be different setup for that. Let it be. So here, as I told you that how we can create invoices from front end, and same we can create using the REST API. So now our main purpose is to use the same REST API in Oracle integration to create the invoices. So for creating the invoices, we got to know that what is the request payload, so that the same request payload we can map while calling this API from integration. So as we have to call the API, REST API, that's why we need to create REST adapter connection. And while creating the REST adapter connection, we have to provide this host so that the invoice, or we can the invoke REST API for this host only, right? So here let me move to the integration. In the connection part, we have to create connection. So for creating the connection, as we are going to create a REST connection, so I will select the REST endpoint, and here we have to provide the name. So I will give the name XX REST INV invoke con. So this is our REST connection name. Let me make copy of that so that's the same I can use in integration. And now here you can see we selected role as trigger and invoke so that the Same connection can be used as a trigger and invoking the REST API. So go and click on create. And here we have to provide the connection type as REST-based URL and connection URL. So what is the connection URL? So here you can see this is the API we are going to hit from the Invoke. So I will copy this host and I will paste the host here. Now after that we have to provide the user and password. So the user we used here, same user we will pass. Now we given the user ID and password to the connection. Now it's time to test. So once we will click on test, the status will be changed to 100%. It means our connection is tested successfully. Now we have to click on save so that it can be changed to draft to configure status. So we save successfully and go back. So here you can see in OIC exam like 2023, there were one questions like while configuring the connection and changing the status from draft to configure, which values is not required. So here you can see while creating the connection, we can have option to add the agent, but we don't have option to add the lookup details, right? So there were one option that providing the lookup values. So that was not mandatory while creating the connection. So that was the correct answer for that. So here we created the connection. Now it's time to create the integration. So here let's move to the integration part and we are going to click on create. As we have to configure the request and the response payload both, so we will select the app driven integration. Select here, we will give the name as XX, create AP Invoice Integration 01. Click on create. So now we added the app driven integration. We have to add the REST endpoint first so that we can configure the request and the response payload. So just click here to add the connection. So here we have created connection as XX REST INV invoice. So I will select this connection. Next, here we have to provide the endpoints. So I'm just going to use as create invoice int. And here we have to select host because we want to configure the request and response payload. So now in request payload, what value we want to give? So in request payload, we want to pass same values, whatever values we require to create the AP invoices. So at the time of executing the integration, user will pass same values. So I will just provide the same values here so that the same we can map in the integration only. Okay. Next. So here we added all the details. Now it's time to go for next. So here we have to configure the response payload. For configuring the request payload, so response payload, again we have to select JSON, and in response what we want to return back. So in response we want to return back something like that. In response, suppose we are going to return back the status. Status will be as success or error, and the invoice number, invoice ID. Once invoice created, it will return back the invoice ID. And if invoice not created, it will return back the error and the invoice ID will be NY8. That kind of things we are going to configure as response of the integration. So here we will provide that value. Okay. Next. And done. We successfully able to configure the REST endpoint to add the request and response payload. Now here we have to invoke the REST API to create the invoices. For invoking that one, we need to again add the REST connection. We need to add the REST connection with this API. So whatever REST connection we created with this host, we have to select that connection. So as we use the same connection here, XX REST INV, I will select here. And here we have to give the name. I will give the name as create invoice. And here you can see we have to provide the URI. So as we are going to use the REST endpoint, REST connection as an invoke, so this will be the actual URI which will be used to create the invoices. So what actual URI means? Here you can see this is the host details we provided in the connection, and this is the URI we have to provide while for creating the invoices. So same I will copy here, and here we have to paste. Now it's done. As this API having the method as post, so I need to select post here, and once we are going to select post, we have to provide the request and response payload. Go next. So we know that this is the actual request payload we are using to create the invoice. So I will copy the same request payload here, and in the request payload we will provide the same sample file here. Okay. And next we know that once we are creating invoices, we are getting this response. So I will just copy this one, and I will pass this response in the response payload invoke connection. Okay, and next and done. So we successfully able to add the REST endpoint to invoke the REST API, any third party REST API. Now we have to provide the mapping. So in the mapping, if we will expand here, here you can see in the request wrapper we have all this value. Invoice line, once we will expand the invoice line, here you can see we have the line details. So same as whatever value we have here, you can see the invoice line and the invoice header details. So same we have to map, and we know that all this value we are getting as a request payload of that integration, right? So we will expand the request wrapper, and in request wrapper you can see we have all this value. The same value we can have the requirement to get this value from database table and all. So we already learned how to work on the database operation. So we can use the database activity to get all this data from table and map the data here. So right now I'm just going to map this invoice number here, the invoice currency, invoice amount, invoice date, business unit, supplier, supplier site, invoice group, description, and the as we know that we can have multiple invoice lines. So that's why we have array elements. So I will map this array with this array element, and the line number with line number, line amount with line amount, and the accounting date with accounting date. So now we are done with the value to create the AP invoices. And remember one thing, this value can be based on the setup also. As I told you that whatever setup we have done for the tables invoices, the value can be depend on that. So right now we are not going to provide any distribution details, like, so based on that, details can be picked from the configuration of the invoice setup only, right? So now we're done with the mapping. We are going to close here. So here you can see once we will call this API will create the invoice, and in response this will return back the invoice ID and rest of the details, right? So in this invoice ID we have to map in response, right? So here in the response wrapper you can say create invoice is the endpoint. So a response of this endpoint will having the invoice ID. So here you can see in the response wrapper we have the status as success. So let me make this as hard coded success. And here we have invoice ID, and this invoice ID we are receiving from the response of this create invoice. So here you can see this is the invoice ID. So we will map this invoice ID here. So we are done with the mapping. Everything is working perfectly fine. Just go close. Now here we can see we created the integration which will get the data, invoice data as a request payload, and same data it will map to the REST API, the REST third API we call, and once it will get the response as an invoice ID, we map the invoice ID in the integration response. We are done with that. Just save and activate this integration. So now integration, oh sorry, we again activate wrong integration. So this is our create AP invoice integration. I will activate this integration. Now we'll wait to activate this integration. Once integration will be activated, we will run this integration. The integration is activated now. We have to run here. Click on test. And here you can see in body we are passing the request payload. So this is the same request payload we configure. So instead of that, here I will again copy the same as once we configure the change order is changed. So here we got given the response payload. Here we have the request payload. Now here you can see we have to change the invoice number. So here I will change the invoice number as XXINV INT for integration test, and here will be 01. So now we are going to hit here. It will give the change the description. Voice created through configuration. Once we will click on test, the same data will be passed to the integration, and that integration will map same data to the invoke REST API, and that invoke REST API will create the invoices and it will return back the invoice ID. Once we will go through the response, you can see in the response we got the message as success we hard coded and the invoice ID we created. And if we will search the invoice ID from invoice number, this invoice number from front end, we will be able to find this invoice number. Here, search. You can see we got the same invoice number here. XXINV test 001. And now suppose what will happen if we pass the invalid data. So right now you can see this invoice is already created. It will not allow to create duplicate invoice. So if we will pass the same data again, it will generate an error. So just click on test and here you can see we got an exception, right? We got exception that by the request you must provide a unique invoice number, all the details. So how we can handle these things in integration? So we know that where we got error while creating the invoice in the create invoice endpoint. So because of runtime error or the exception, we will not able to add the integration is not able to return the response. So how we can handle? Let's see. So here we know that we are getting error here in this endpoint, right? So what we will do? We will add this thing inside the scope only. So we will add one scope and we will drag these two elements. And we will drag these two elements inside the scope only, right? So here I will do the reposition. That's two are done inside that. So here you can see right now we are done with the mapping, but you can see here in the response of the integration mapper we map the invoice ID, but we have the invoice ID inside the scope only, so we cannot access this value outside the scope. For that what we need to do, we need to create one variable. That variable will be updated inside the scope, and then same we can use that variable outside because we created the variable outside. So let me first create the variable. So I will create two variables. The one variable will be a status and the second variable will be the invoice ID. So here I will create var underscore status, and right now this value will be empty. I will configure these two value in case of success and in case of error. And now here we have to use the variable for var invoice ID. And here let me add one more value as a request payload, so that in case of error, we can return back the error details also, right? So in the request payload, let me add one more values and the message process message. So if integration completed successfully, it will process message be like invoice created successfully, success, and then invoice created successfully and invoice added. And in case of invalid, this process message will have the invoice error details, whatever error details we got. So for that, we have to update the endpoint so that we can change the response payload. Here in the response payload, we have to update the response payload here. Next, and then we know that whenever we are updating the trigger endpoint, we have to add the tracing variable again because the tracing variable got removed. So here you can see we have two errors. Once we will map this tracking variable, one error will be resolved, and another error is for mapping. So we will update the variable mapping again. So for storing this error message, again we required one variable. That variable store the message var underscore MESSG message process message. In starting, every value will having the default value as null or empty value, so that based on the condition we can update the value. Validate and close. So now suppose our control move inside the scope, it's created the invoice successfully. Then we have to map the success value. So in case of success, we will update that variable created outside as a success. So we will use success assign create, and here we will select the variable and we will update the value. So the first variable will be a status, and the status we will provide the message as SUCCS success. We have error because I given the single quotes and the double quotes. So we have to pass the same values. Close. Now another variable will be the error message or process message. So as invoice created successfully, we have to provide the process message as invoice created successfully. Validate and close. And now again we have to provide the invoice ID. So we'll select the invoice ID. And from where we will get the invoice ID details? We will get the invoice ID details from the create invoice response. So here you can see we have the create invoice. This is the response. So we'll expand here. And here you can see invoice ID. So I will map this invoice ID there. Validate and close. Validate, close. So now we are done with the success message. Now we have to go for the error. So in case of any error, it will move to the fault handler. And here we will define the default handler. In the default handler, we have to again do the mapping, and in the mapping we will update the variable with the error message. So here we will use error for assign create, and the status variable will be updated by error. Error, and again we have to map the value for process message. So right now we know that we got the error. So whenever we are going to move control inside the scope fault handler, we will have the object. We will have the object for fault handler. So let me show you the object for fault handler. Here you can see create invoice is our scope name. Create invoice scope is the scope name, and here you can see the fault object. And the fault object store the details, the error code, reason, details, all these things. So I want to return all these things right in the response only. So how we will map? So you can see where process message is our variable, right? A string variable. So we have to convert this node into a string. For that we have one function get context as a string. Here we have one function that get content as a string. So I will drag here, and it will ask the element or node. So whatever node we will provide here, that node will be converted into a string, and that will store here in the where process message. Just click on validate and close. And here we are done with that, and we have to update the value for invoice ID. So right now we don't have invoice ID in case of error. So I will map n by a as not available. Validate and close. So now we are done with that. We added the scope so that we can handle the exception at runtime only. And we added the variable values based on that status. If success, we updated the variable value as success. In case of exception, we added the value as error. Now the same value we have to map in the mapper only, right? So here in mapper, right now we don't want to pass any hard-coded value as we created the variable for that only. So all these things we will first delete the target node, expand here, and here you can see a status we will map with the status variable. Process message will be mapped with this process message, and invoice ID will be mapped with invoice ID. So we are done with the mapping. Validate and close. So now our integration is completed, and now it's ready to handle the exception, all these things. So now here we have to go for cancel, save, and integration is already in configure status as we don't have any error there. So we will activate this integration. Now it will take a bit of time to activate. So it actually activated. Now we have to run this integration. So in body you can see, friend, this invoice already created, right? This invoice is already created. When we will submit this, it will generate an error. That error will be handled in the fault handler, and it will show the message. So here you can see what we have. Integration, you can see once we got the error, integration is not completed. After the error, it moved to the fault handler. In fault handler, we added the assign to perform operation, and after that it come outside, it provides the mapping to the integration response. And the same mapping you can see we find here. Status as errors, process message, we have the fault object, all the details whatever we will have inside the fault. Here you can see, and you can see the message we have the this invoice number already exists. You must provide a unique invoice number. As you can see, the value, whatever value we map, the value having the error details, error code, and the error message, all these things. Even whatever we can do, we can pass the error reason only, or we can pass the error code only, that AP invoice invocation error, or that kind of things we can map. So just for testing purpose, I completely map the default value. And here you can see in invoice ID we have NYA not available as we map. And suppose if we pass the invoice ID as different invoice ID, we'll click on test. That invoice will be created in the system, and it will return back the invoice ID. So here you can see invoice created, status success, invoice created successfully, and the invoice ID. So friend, this is the simple way we can create integration where we can invoke the any third-party REST API or any API. So third-party SOAP API we already cover while working on the calling the BI report. So that can be different SOAP API. For example, while creating the purchase order, we have the SOAP API to create the purchase order. We don't have any REST API to create the purchase order. So yes, you can try with that SOAP API for creating the purchase order also. And same similar things, whatever we have done here, I have already created videos and we placed over the YouTube like for the requisition only. So the same as we created requisition from front end first, then use the REST API to create the requisition, then created the integration to use the same REST API to create the requisition. So friend, hope fully this is the last session for Oracle integration. Tomorrow we will have session where I will show you one TDD, technical design document for integration. So whenever we are working on the development and any project, so what kind of environment we are getting, and like once integration completed, what kind of documents we have to create, all the things we are going to discuss in the next session. For example, what I will do is that I created this integration AP invoice, and I will create TDD for this AP invoice only, and I will show you that what all the details we provided in this technical document, so that you can have the basic overview of the document. So what kind of document we have to submit, or obvious whenever we are saying that FSD or TDD, so that document is specifically for the organization based, right? So suppose we are working for KPMG or we are working for Deloitte, so all different company having the different format of the TDD and FSD. So that a specific format they share with the client, and that document having the all the details related to the development whatever we have done. Even that can be for BI report, or that can be for the integration we created, or anything whatever we have work on the development side. So thank you so much guys for joining the session. If anyone having any queries, yes, we can continue to ask or we will drop the session and we will come tomorrow with the document so that I can show you and basic of the interviews and all how you can go for preparation and all we can discuss tomorrow. And yes, I request you everyone that if anyone having any questions and you want to ask, just you can make a note of the question so that to in tomorrow session we can discuss on the questions whatever you have. If I have the answer for that question, so that we can have the one-to-one session as like in during the session or the during explanation I observed that no one have asked anything, but yes, no issue. So tomorrow is the chance we can have one-to-one discussion, and yes, whatever you want to ask you can ask tomorrow. So if anyone having any doubt right now, you can ask or we can wrap up for today. So thank you so much guys. I hope everyone is fine. So now we are going to end the session for today.